Thank you very much, Camille, and good morning. Welcome to our last substantive panel of this morning. My name is García, competition expert at the OECD, and today I have the pleasure to have here with me three excellent panelists to discuss the future of efficiency analysis in merger review. Already this morning, Professor Guillaume gave us excellent remarks on what efficiencies can mean for competition in the markets. So we will do our best to keep up with his excellent presentation to discuss what the future holds in terms of efficiencies in merger review. I have with me today Guillaume Loriot to my left. He's the Deputy Director-General for Mergers at DG Comp. Next to him, Camila Pires-Alves, Commissioner at the Conselho Administrativo da Defesa Econômica CADE, the competition authority in Brazil, and Professor at the Institute of Economics of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And next to me, to my right, I have Nicholas Woodrow, Director at Woodrow Advisory Services, and former Group Legal Director on Competition, Trade and Financial Crime at Vodafone. So welcome. Thank you very much. And as you can see, these are experts that are involved in looking at mergers in a daily basis, either from the perspective of the competition authority, from the academic perspective, or as part of the legal team of merging parties or companies that are third parties to many, many proceedings. For the audience, we will have Q&A as it's been the case in the past couple of sessions. So please feel free to start thinking about questions to ask our panelists. And if you are connecting online, please drop the question in our chat and we will do our best to reply to your questions. So now let me just give you a quick context before moving to the debate on why we are discussing efficiencies today. Actually, this is the second time in less than a year that we discuss efficiencies in mergers here at the OECD. Back in June 2025, we had the possibility to have a roundtable on efficiencies where our delegates shared experiences, but also challenges that they have faced, very practical issues on the way they evaluate efficiencies in mergers. I did see back then a good appetite to review efficiencies and more broad to do analysis in mergers, thinking about more dynamic ways of understanding markets in realities like the ones we are living now. We just discussed digitalization in the financial sector. So of course, efficiency analysis in mergers also is trying to keep up with this dynamism. But I have to say that I also left the meeting in June with a couple of questions. So I decided to continue the conversation today in front of all of you, also to dig a bit deeper on some of the aspects that were mentioned back then. For example, on the discussion on whether efficiencies should stay as a rare consideration in mergers, or at least as explicit as they have been now, whether it's the legal framework that should change, or perhaps it's the way it's being implemented in practice. Just a month ago, Benoit Curé was in a panel on 1.5 years after the Draghi report, which was mentioned today multiple times, and he was saying that perhaps what we need to look at is ways of implementing the efficiency analysis in a way that also allows competition authorities to increase their dialogue with parties to mergers to see how else we can assess efficiencies in a way that it really completes the analysis of mergers. So today I want the discussion to have a forward-looking perspective where we discuss what comes now. The debate is still open, clearly, but while we found many points of convergence back then when we listened to the authorities, for example, on the type of efficiencies taken into account, on the fact that perhaps authorities give more relevance to efficiencies that are directly linked to prices, we found areas where we wanted to discuss a bit more. And one of these areas also touched during Professor Guillaume's speech today was, for example, whether efficiencies can be a way to consider broader public interests. He talked about how there should be an alignment with industrial policy, but does it really mean that in practice we should take into account industrial policy when reviewing mergers, particularly when reviewing efficiencies? So these are part of the things that I want to discuss today with you. So let me just jump into the questions, and let me start with you, Guillaume. What do you think are the key principles of efficiencies analysis in the Commission, and what are the areas of current debate?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I think indeed this debate is very important. Maybe let me, to answer your question, let me give you a bit of a snapshot on, where we're coming from, what's happening now, and maybe, looking forward, what are the key questions. If you have only 2 questions, that's actually good. I think we have many. So where we're coming from, I think at the moment, as you know, in the EU, we're reviewing the merger guidelines. So there's been a broad public consultation. It will continue, endlessly. To have this dialogue on many very sensitive topics on competition, including on efficiencies. And I think the feedback we got from stakeholders generally, that's something that we've heard, is about how to take into account an even more forward-looking approach, dynamic competition, and so on. Something that we've been discussing for years and doing actually in many cases for years, but the aspect that is obviously very new and difficult is about how to apply that to efficiencies. So not only static efficiencies like price efficiencies, cost cutting and so on, but also longer term dynamic efficiencies, meaning innovation essentially. And that's it's always been a very difficult debate. I think stakeholders, what do they say? Well, essentially the kind of 3-pronged test that competition authorities have, whether in Europe or elsewhere, about verifiability, causation, merger specificity, and benefits to the customers, essentially, or consumers. That the principles are sound, but how to make that, the application of these principles not too rigid, essentially. I think that's a fair picture. Now, we all know that the topic is difficult. One, because I think 95% of mergers are approved, many with remedies. So the way in which competition authorities enter into the efficiency debate has been really in context where there was a strong concern. So that's something to discuss on the process and the engagement, because obviously, and I'm not saying, I think everyone is a bit responsible. You don't engage until there's a concern, and that makes, the whole discussion very difficult. The second thing is that obviously, and let's be, very honest, and I think listening to Professor Guillaume also is that, competition being a driver of innovation, not only green innovation, innovation generally, obviously, the cases in which anti-competitive mergers are good for innovation and ultimately competition, is a bit of it's not evident, let's say. So prima facie, it is really rare that you see, a merger raising concerns all of a sudden being very pro-innovation. I mean, it's not, at least it's exceptional. It would be exceptional. And I think that's something that the OECD paper in 25 last year actually was very, underlined a lot. That, there's a lot of evidence that, expose that efficiencies do not really materialize, or that, it's, they're not, necessarily as large as they are, they are rather limited sometimes. And there's a lot of academic studies showing that, especially in very concentrated markets, efficiencies are not really necessarily where they materialize, and which is precisely where they would make a difference. So, you know, there's a context that is obviously, you know, kind of challenging for competition authorities. However, and even more so, it is important to understand when it can make the difference, because obviously that's exceptional, and that's why we've engaged not only on a very targeted consultation on this issue, but also in an economic study which is being done to look at these aspects, especially on dynamic efficiencies, how to make sure that, you know, we have a right taxonomy, the right approach, and being concrete and practical. And that's, I think, a fair and very important point now. So where are we now? I mean, there are many things I think we can agree with many stakeholders. I think, you know, the fact of having a more dynamic approach generally is something we've been calling for, and I think we were rather on the other side of the debate some years ago when we had these cases about, you know, innovation theories of harm and so on. So you know, for us it's a natural development, and fair enough, you know, that should include a debate on efficiencies that go beyond prices, if that's the debate. So having a kind of holistic approach on dynamic effects, which is not only the harm but potentially the benefits. So we agree on the fact that, you know, innovation is very important, that competition goes beyond price competition. It's also a parameter of competition, and it's in line with the past experience we've had. And we realize that some mergers may have positive effects on innovation. That, I think, is in principle in agreement. Now, the other point that stakeholders, you know, I think are underlining is that they call for the Commission to take more risk, you know, that there's this uncertainty on how innovation will materialize, and that we should apply kind of symmetric standard of proof when it's about harm and efficiencies. At the same time, I think, and that's very important, stakeholders realize that we should have an objective assessment, you know, evidence-based assessment, because obviously otherwise, you know, it doesn't add more predictability, you know, predictability, and then, you know, double standards are not what businesses want, and that's not what we want. So we need to go back to the drawing board in a way, and make sure that on the one hand we ask ourselves, you know, how can we ensure that our assessment really captures efficiencies that may be related to the long term, so very forward-looking. How do you make sure that, you know, you're not in a kind of speculative, you know, area? And that's precisely my second point. How do you make, you know, the difference between genuine efficiencies versus wishful thinking? I think the OECD paper talks about vague assertions, you know, and that's, I think that's really one of the challenges. So it's the same as for theories of harm in the guidelines, you know. How do you make sure that you put out criteria that you know, are reflecting sound economics, that they're objective, they are concrete enough, you know, principled and pragmatic, as some prime minister would have said in another context. So that's really, these are difficult questions, and I think there are essentially three very difficult questions. Is one, you know, what type of merger synergies determine really the ability to innovate post-merger? What or when will a merger, you know, structurally improve the incentive to innovate, even when competition is somehow lessened? You know, how do you make that trade-off? And that's the third point. How do you balance out sometimes? How do you make a trade-off between short-term effects versus longer-term effects? Either way, you know, I think that these are really difficult questions, especially if you're comparing different parameters. So prices versus innovation, you know, so that's not really, but these are important questions. So where are we going? I will not, you know, we're still working on our guidelines, but the implications for merger control, I think, are two or threefold. One is that, I mean, obviously we will not refuse to engage just because it's difficult. But I think one of the first questions is, you know, how to balance out the fact that there's uncertainty about a precise outcome in the market. So you never know when you look at a merger, whether it's as a theory of harm or as a theory of benefit, you know, whether the innovation will take place. What you want is to make sure that there's a competitive process that drives innovation. I mean, essentially what, you know, Professor Guillaume said this morning, you want that there's this race to innovation. You never know who will win. You don't want to know. So there's this tension. On the other hand, you want to be certain, at least you want to find it plausible and probable, that there's an incentive from the merger to engage in that innovation race. And I think that's really the test that we need to you know, make clear, is that to balance out, you know, the uncertainty of the outcome versus making sure that there's a mechanism, economic mechanism, not an artificial requirement, that the merger is creating immediately in the short term this incentive to, you know, go on and innovate. You know, that can be complementary R&D. So, you know, there are many things we can think about, but many things that you think about not necessarily when there's a competition concern, you see? And I think that's the point that is very difficult, is the trade-off assuming that there's a concern, because it's easier when there's no concern, and in fact that's what happens in practice, is that very often you have the bigger picture, you see that the merger is not really harmful and potentially even beneficial, because you see these complementarities and so on. The second point, I think, which is obvious, sorry to say, is the quality of the evidence, but also the type of evidence. You know, how can you make sure that you have something that is not a promise, but rather, you know, an economic analysis that shows that there is this incentive as a result of a transaction. And third, but we'll talk about that, is engaging. Engaging with parties early on. I think that's not something maybe we've done before, because there was this vicious circle of parties not willing to engage because they thought it would become a problem rather than a defense. And so having that even on a no prejudice basis, as we do in many instances, is something I'm repeating. And sorry for that, but because I think it's important that that message, you know, is passed on, that it will not be held against you. We want to understand, we want to engage. It doesn't mean we will agree, but at least we want to understand. I think there's a lot of progress to do, because as I mentioned from the OECD paper, there's a lot of skepticism from financial authorities to competition authorities, because indeed, you know, the ex post studies are not really showing how you can really focus on that. We have past cases, but you know, it's on very concrete stuff rather than very general assertions. So that's maybe, you know, my introduction. Sorry if I'm a bit long.
No, that's great. I want to come back to those practical aspects in a moment, but first, let me turn to Camila, because you also touched upon a couple of aspects on innovation, how to really take into account dynamic efficiencies, for example, when there is a trade-off between short-term and long-term effects. And I know, Camila, you have done a lot of research on the topic, so let me turn to you for your views.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for the OECD for the invitation. I think that when you were talking about merger control and dynamic efficiency, we face a clear tension, and very often we still treat efficiencies as something of an add-on. So what I mean is this: efficiencies are often discussed after we already built the competitive harm story, rather than something that helps shape the assessment from the outset. And also, another point, as Professor Guillaume just put it so well, and also Guillaume, there is the dual tension between competitive pressure that can drive innovation, but successful innovation may also lead to greater concentration and lessen of competition. My aim today, I mean, in that discussion is not to romanticize innovation and certainly not to lower standards of proof. The aim is to suggest a more disciplined way to test innovation efficiencies. I don't think that we are already in this place, but I think we may have some clues on what is the best way to go. So I think that this best way would be what is academically grounded, operational for agencies, and also honest about our institutional constraints. And so merger controls often evaluates efficiency as a late stage, as I was saying, balancing exercise harms on one side and benefits on the other. But when parties invoke innovation, this framing can be misleading. Innovation is rarely a plug-in benefit that can simply be netted out. Innovation efficiencies are not accounting synergies, I guess. We can say that, and it's different of a particular type from, or maybe a particular time of an investment. They are dynamic, uncertain, and deeply dependent on incentives, organizational capabilities, and how the merged firm will actually be run. Innovation is not a static end, as Guillaume said. It is a process, a trajectory shaped by incentives, capabilities, and governance. So this is where I personally find it helpful, both as an enforcer and as an academic, to use a dynamic incentives and capability lens. And from that perspective, the key questions becomes, what is the mechanisms? How exactly does this merger change the abilities of firms to identify opportunities, commit resource, and reconfigure assets and routines over time in a way that makes innovation more likely than it would have been otherwise? A credible answer, I mean, maybe the main message would be that a credible answer cannot stop at general statements. It has to show concretely why post-merger decision-making will strengthen incentives to innovate rather than dilute them. And it has to also to explain how governance will actually allocate budgets, authority, and internal priorities so that innovation is not crowded out by short-term commercial pressures. And it must also show that the execution is realistic, given the real friction of integration, so skill, data, talent, intellectual property, complementary assets, and the organization cost of combining teams and systems. This all are massed in mixed to give the answers that we want. So in other words, this is not about innovation as a promise, and it's about innovation as an implementable plan whose logic can be examined and challenged by the authority. And so maybe another contribution would be that to answer that, we need to open the box and look at how things actually work in the market. And we need to understand the dynamics. So, and for that, it is important to take, I believe, a plural approach. So post-Schumpeterian scholars who study very deep innovation process, for example, can be very helpful in informing this analysis. They also remind us a second discipline that I think it's essential, that the sectorial dimension. So innovation stories do not travel well across markets. They depend on what innovation economists, there is one very important that cite the Pavitt that is in the literature since the 80s that calls the sector's technological regime. So the triad opportunities, cumulativeness, and appropriability. So we need to understand the structure of opportunities, how abundant and accessible are the innovation possibilities in that sector, the degree of cumulativeness in learning, and the conditions of appropriability, how returns are captured by successful innovative firms. And the same innovation narrative, or even the merger reasoning narrative, may be persuasive in one regime and quite weak in another. So to make short, because probably I'm going very into my time, I don't think it's discretion. This is an analytical discipline. And maybe the last message would be that we should avoid a generic checklist for innovation efficiencies. So instead, require a mechanism-based narrative and then stress test that narrative against the relevant sectoral regime. So in other words, what can realistically be appropriated, how cumulative learning actually is, where innovation opportunities come from, and whether post-merger governance truly makes that innovation path more plausible than before the merger. So yes, I think that's my very short, sorry for taking too long, but should be short, compliments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, you both mentioned the relevance of collaborating and engaging with the private sector to understand the business dynamics and if the efficiencies, for example, will get to materialize. So let me now consult with the private sector. And Nick, how would you react to what they just said from this industry perspective?
Thank you, Aura, and thank you to the OECD for inviting me. I think the reason I've been invited was because I was involved in the Vodafone 3 merger in the UK, which in my mind was mostly about efficiencies. I no longer work for Vodafone, so I don't speak to them, although I am still a customer of Vodafone. I'm also a customer of another mobile network in the UK as well. So multi-homing, like in banking we heard earlier. I think that this is a very useful discussion to have, and I would recommend the OECD paper on merger efficiencies, which I think was a very useful contribution to the debate. One of the things I learned reading that was that people talk about European jurisdictions having in the past thought about efficiency offences, which I think they clearly did. But the interesting thing is learning that the US used to have an efficiency offence as well, now rather a long time in the past. But I think it shows that regulators all over the world have been on a journey where originally efficiencies were potentially thought as theories of harm. And part of that, I think, is driven by the fact that a lot of these regulatory processes are driven by competitors. And one of the things that we heard about earlier was the technology gap that can sometimes exist in markets. And I think in some markets, what you see mergers which are potentially delivering efficiencies and could overall be pro-competitive, and they end up being opposed by those who are actually leading the market at the moment and actually don't want the merger to happen because it might result in more competition. I think on the private sector side, I think there's lots of things that we agree with the regulators on. I think the direction of travel is definitely right. Efficiencies, in my mind, are the other side of the coin of some of the theories of harm. We've heard about innovation sometimes being regarded as theory of harm. It must also be a potential efficiency. And I think that a lot of these debates are about balancing those two. In some unproblematic mergers where you've got two smaller players merging together to create the scale and the efficiency to be able to compete with a market leader, quite often there's no discussion of the efficiency because there isn't a competition problem. So I agree with Guillaume. I think it's helpful to be more explicit when you're talking about these mergers and actually making efficiencies a bigger part of the substantive conversation about whether a merger is net positive for competition or net negative. in my mind, it's been quite unhelpful, I think, to think about efficiencies just as a defence. I'm a big believer in if you've got an efficiencies argument, you should be upfront about it. As Guillaume said, these cases are all decided on the evidence. The evidence and the facts of different cases will be different. And so it's important, if you think you've got an efficiencies case, to be upfront about that. Now that helps in terms of having the substantive argument at the same time as you're having the argument about the theories of harm, when what the regulators are trying to do is to actually make trade-offs, make balancing judgments. If you're only discussing them at the end of the process, that's not very helpful. So I think efficiencies have to be part of the core discussion about whether there's a substantive competition problem. And quite often, and it's quite interesting that Guillaume talked about innovation versus competition. I can understand that sometimes they might point in different directions, but I think it's critical to remember that innovation is part of competition. I don't think there are any markets where it's not possible to innovate. And as we heard this morning from Professor Guillaume, the way that you compete in many markets is you innovate. Now, that's not to say that price competition isn't important as well. It always will be important. But it's recognizing that innovation is part of that competitive dynamic. And it's why I think you should talk about that up front as part of one overall equation. And one of the things that was mentioned earlier about efficiencies was the difficulties of evidence. Merger control is an analysis of what you think is going to happen in the future. So it's inherently uncertain on both sides of the coin, the theories of harm and the efficiencies. Personally, I don't see any reason why one side of the coin is more difficult than the other. It's only made more difficult if you're talking about the efficiencies at the end, when you've already discussed and decided what your theory of harm is. If you're discussing it all as part of one overall assessment of the effect of the merger, then I don't see any reason why one is more difficult than the other. And finally, I think one of the other things which I think has been helpful about the recent discussion is this talk about timeframes. There are lots of markets where innovation cycles, investment cycles are longer than the time frame that competition authorities traditionally think of as being the time frame for assessing efficiencies of 3 to 5 years or whatever it is. I think that has to move, because if you take the view that you're not going to look at any potential, any efficiencies that arise beyond 5 years, you invariably take a short-term view. And, is that part of the reason we are where we are, with innovation and growth being a problem in Europe? Possibly. So I think, taking a longer-term view, I think would be helpful in terms of actually giving innovation and growth a proper consideration and balancing it against your short-term effects.
Thank you, Nick. It seems that timing considerations are also a key practicality of how relevant this efficiency analysis in mergers ends up being. So let me now ask our audience, help us with one question, which is, in your view, when should competition authorities then assess merger efficiencies? Do they need to do it only when parties raise it? When parties raise it, but there has also been competition concerns already identified, or should they analyze them always regardless of whether they have been claimed by the parties or not? when you answer the poll, let me do some self-advertising, because Nick reminded me that there are some copies of the papers available in the back of the room, but also online. So there is a QR code as well around for the paper. But let us wait for a second and see what the answer is. And Nick, I would like to know in practice, how do you and when do you incorporate the efficiencies in your filing strategy?
If you read any press release for a merger, there'll be lots of numbers and financial projections. But in terms of the sort of the value of any transaction, there are essentially two main parts. It's the standalone value of the two businesses that you're putting together, and there's the synergies. And the synergies are the additional value that you get from putting two things together. So you get 2 + 2 = 5. Now, the synergies will usually have two types: cost synergies and revenue synergies. Financial markets tend to be a little bit more uncertain about revenue synergies because they are maybe more speculative. They love cost synergies. But the point is that these synergies are part of the business case, the financial business case for putting together your merger. And those benefits, if you've got an efficiencies case, will usually underpin your efficiencies case as well. So if you've got synergies in your merger which actually create those efficiencies, why wouldn't you bring them in up front? You know, you've given the numbers to your investors. You believe that if I put these two businesses together, I can build this big new shiny network. I can save these costs. I can get all of this additional revenue from having a better network. You know, why wouldn't you put that in up front? Now, as I discussed earlier, part of the reason was people were worried that that would be seen as a problem. And in the past, 20 odd years ago, that has been the case. Now, I think the message from Guillaume is, no, put that in up front, and we can have a proper discussion of both the efficiencies and the theories of harm at the same time. And certainly, you know, that's what Vodafone and Three did in the UK. If you look at the press release for that transaction back in 2024, whenever it was, actually 2023, I'm a year out. You know, the benefits of the merger were, you know, front and center of the case that was put to the financial investors as well as to the competition authority. And I think that helps both in terms of making sure that you're helping the regulator in that balance between the benefits of the transaction and the efficiencies as against any theory of harm that they might consider. And I think it also helps from an evidence perspective. The fact that this is not something that could be seen as something that was thought up after the event. It's something that was front and center of the transaction from the first moment. And that helps because, you know, it's in your financial projections, it's in your business cases, and that sort of supports all your arguments that actually this is something that is going to be done.
Thank you very much. The audience seems to be a bit split. Around 40% said that efficiencies should be assessed relatively late when concerns on competition have already been identified, while other 40% thought that they should be assessed always, regardless of whether they are put forward by the parties. Guillaume, what do you think?
I don't know if they include the 90% of cases that are under a simplified process, because in that case, I think it will make it much heavier. So I mean, let's be honest. You know, I think it's very important that we engage, but we're talking about cases which are not going under the kind of simplified screening in 3 weeks, where businesses have an interest to go through quickly, and fortunately, many mergers are unproblematic. So I think one thing is to engage, one thing is to, you know, focus your resources where, both on the business side and the enforcer side, on where it matters. I think where, but I think maybe to react to Nick's point, unless you had another question, I think it's very important. I don't want to suggest that it's not important for the enforcer to understand always the rationale of a merger. That's always what we try to do. The debate goes beyond that, because obviously we always do that. Even for a simplified case, you try to understand, okay, what is it about? What's the stated rationale? And if you need to go further, look at the board documents and so on. I mean, it's always been there. And I think for the last 20 years, things have changed a lot, practically, thank God. So that is obvious, you know, having people in the enforcers department that are business-minded and try to understand the impact and how the, you know, merging parties see the impact of their own merger. That's what we do in every case. The debate on efficiencies goes beyond, because it is, and especially if you're calling for symmetry, you know, it demands a lot of, you know, practical evidence, and so you know, you will not push a company to provide everything if there's no real issue in the first place. You try to understand it, but then it's a bit granular and practical. So just to say that.
Thank you. Any reactions, Camila? Wonderful. So let me now move to another topic that I wanted to cover today. As we all know, we discussed that there is a trend about trying to use efficiencies as a path to consider broader public interests. For example, by expanding the scope of the type of efficiencies considered to talk about environmental effects, innovation, industrial policy, as we have been discussing today. But at the same time, we're seeing quite a lot of literature and empirical evidence on increasing concentration in multiple markets that are joined by calls for stricter merger control, also leaving less room for what Guillaume mentioned on speculative efficiency claims. The Draghi report, the CMA recently launched a review of their approach to review efficiencies, which actually closed only last week. DGCOM's revision of the merger guidelines, they all seem to show that the authorities are open and are discussing now these sort of questions. Let me ask the audience again to help us with this debate and let us know your views on whether competition authorities should take into account these broader public objectives when assessing merger efficiencies. Professor Guillaume did said this morning or gave a call for reconciling competition and industrial policy, but Camila, I want to ask you, what are your views on this? Are merger efficiencies a way to do this? What's the relationship here between merger control and other areas such as innovation and industrial policy?
Well, we are, when we are talking about the structural transformation in merger, we are talking about structural transformation. And it crazily means that economic decisions are also normative choices and choices about technological direction, resilience, sustainability, and strategic priorities. So whether we like it or not, the broader effects of the policy we enforce or study matters and are part of the environment in which competition policy operates. And so I think there is institutional questions that becomes unavoidable. So who decides what, under which criteria, and with what accountability? I think that the point is not to import broad public objectives into antitrust in a diffusion way through ad hoc discretion in individual cases. Instead, the point is to coordinate competition policy and other public policies explicitly and around national or regional goals and through institutional design. So that means transparency, participation where appropriate, clear decision criteria, and mechanisms of accountability rather than improvising objectives case by case. But I also think that coordination also reflects something deeper. Different policies hold different kinds of knowledge about how economic transformation actually happens. So innovation policy, for example, may have a deeper understanding of how innovation process unfold, how learning occurs, how capabilities are built, how technological opportunities evolve. And the same is true, for example, for green transition policies, which often deal directly with the mechanisms that shape firms' incentives and capabilities to adopt the cleaner technologies we want to. So I don't think that competition authorities do need to replicate all of that expertise, but they should be able to interact with it, learn from it, and contribute to it. In that sense, antitrust also play a distinctive role because competition enforcement operates across a wide range of sectors and cases, and it often functions as a kind of empirical laboratory of market dynamics. And that experience also feed back into other public policies. So coordination should not be seen only as a constraint on antitrust. They help show how a healthy and vigorous competitive process supports broader policies objectives, for example, innovation policy and environment, sustainability, and even macro policies. And because in many contexts, preserving competitive pressure is itself part of what makes those objectives achievable. And the more we circulate our work, the more this understanding can spread across government and regulatory policies. So now, of course, broader objectives such as sustainability or resilience may be considered preferably when they are explicit in law and operationalized through verifiable criteria and accountability. But that does not license diffuse discretion. So if anything, it reinforced the need for analytical discipline and institutional coordination. It also calls for a plurality of knowledge and perspectives. So by that, I mean within areas, across policies, across institutions, and also across countries. So multilateral dialogue is therefore essential, I believe. It allows us to learn from different experiences, including those of the developing countries that have long engaged with innovation and industrial policy. And I think that PICS was just also mentioned as a Brazilian example of interaction between regulatory and competition. So there are no simple answers, I know, but through dialogue, learning, and cooperation, we can build a constructive and inclusive middle path and that preserves the vigor of the competitive process while engaging with the transformation, inclusion, sustainability, competitiveness in the way that we want to shape our economies. Thank you.
Thank you. Your intervention just reminded me of a speech that Professor Jean Tirole gave a couple of weeks ago here in Paris, where he was kind of expressing his concerns about the practical ability of competition authorities to expand their analysis and take into account all of these aspects. And he was mentioning, for example, the fact that it risks competition authorities needing to become experts in how to calculate environmental gains, for example, or impact on innovation that goes beyond what their capabilities are now. And he also highlighted that perhaps this also raises challenges such as that these broader objectives could increase political exposure or weaken institutional independence of the competition authorities. Nick, what are your views on this?
Well, I think the first point is that competition law and competition policy cannot exist in a vacuum. Competition policy is part of broader economic policy, and I think the application of competition policy needs to evolve as the economic context changes. Quite often you get discussions about how adaptable competition law is, and the answer is it is adaptable, because as the economic context, as the market changes, the answer to your investigation may change, and it may change quite significantly. And I think in that context, if we think about Europe and where Europe is at the moment, if we went back 10 years when the economy was sort of growing much more quickly, growth wasn't so much of a concern, you might end up with some different answers on particular cases than you would now, when lack of growth, competitiveness, etc., is clearly a concern. We heard that this morning. We've heard it from Mr. Draghi's report, etc. So I think that's relevant to this current debate on efficiencies, because efficiencies, and in the context of innovation, or whether it's building more capacity, etc., more investment, are all about driving growth. And so we talked earlier about trade-offs, balancing. That is life. Everything is a trade-off. Everything is a balance. And I think as the economic context changes, your balance between innovation and growth versus your short-term considerations may change in terms of what is, the right answer overall, in terms of what is net positive or net pro-competitive in terms of your decision on a merger. So I think the economic context, broader economic context, is very relevant, and I think regulators need to be aware of that. Does that mean you should impose some other policy, whether it's industrial policy, on top of competition law? I think my answer is I don't think you need to, because actually competition policy should be able to adapt.
In line with what you were just saying, our audience in the poll seems to think that, yes, authorities should take into account other public interests. Part of the audience thinks that this should be according to broader government priorities, and the majority thinks that, yes, if these objectives are explicit in the competition law. Guillaume, let me ask you about your views on this, and if you could give us any hint on how the guidelines will position about
Maybe
this.
let me reflect a bit on what was said, and obviously on your questions. And I think there are 2-3 levels of answer. First, just to react to Nick just now, I think the suggestion that competition goes against productivity and investment, which is a bit what I heard, is not. I don't agree with that, and many people don't agree with that. You just listened to Professor Guillaume, who explained, how productivity goes on and may go down precisely when there's less competition, including in tech. Remember, when we launched the cases against Google, I was part of that 10 years ago. It was a bit seen as a problem, whereas we all know now that contestability of markets and competition is a driver of productivity, of innovation. I think we heard it again, of price competition and so on. So I think we should not oppose one against the other. The markets where there's more competition, there's more investment overall. So that we need to be very cautious on what we're talking about, because obviously being pro-innovation, pro-productivity, is not antinomic with competition, quite the contrary. The second thing is about the debate on the public interest versus competition. I think there are, again, two dimensions. There's the and I agree with that, you know, Jean Tirole, John Vickers in Britain, and others, many others, have repeatedly said, well, competition policy cannot achieve in itself other goals. You know, it's not part of that mandate, and there are other regulatory tools. Obviously, you know, I think we all essentially agree with that. You know, it's not through a merger, you know, control procedure that you achieve public security necessarily. You know, there are other tools for that. But I think I agree with Nick. The point is that competition policy has not, I don't think it has, has not existed in a vacuum. You know, you take into account the realities, the market realities that are often driven by also policies and so on, and that translates into, you know, parameters of competition. And I think Professor Guillaume mentioned it, you know, about green innovation as well. You can see that when there's demand from customers, whether because it's imposed by policies or because it's a reality and it's a genuine willingness, you know, that translates into, you know, how you compete, how you put some quality to your products. We've seen that in many cases, actually. So it's not something that is abstract. It's very concrete. You know, we had cases in aluminium where you could see that the demand from car makers was going to some players who were greener because they needed to. We see it in other cases. And so it can translate different ways. You know, if you take this competition parameter, you know, either the merger may reduce that kind of competition, not only on prices, but on, you know, green tech or other things, or it may be beneficial. You know, it cuts both ways. I think there's no, and I think it's important to, you know, to be a bit more nuanced. What is dangerous is obviously pretend that you will achieve something with, you know, another goal than what is competition, because that's not true. And actually, competition in many instances can contribute to these goals. You know, think about green innovation, as we heard this morning. Sorry to repeat it. Or it may even undermine it. So essentially, you know, if there's not enough competition, there's less innovation, there's less productivity. I mean, let's wake up. You know, the lack of a single market, as we heard again this morning, is the real issue about scaling up. And then mergers can, you know, contribute to that. But, you know, we're talking about a few, you know, interventions per year, which are very important, but it's not the prime, you know, that's not the primary tool, and still, I think, contributes to many aspects of, you know, public interest, but in a way that is not, you know, it's policy rather than politics. You know, how is it politically relevant but not politically driven? I think we need to be objective, we need to have criteria, we need to be rigorous, and, you know, obviously, if green innovation matters in a market, you take it into account to see how the market is moving, same for prices and so on. So I think it's more holistic, as you say, than something that is abstract as an exemption clause. It's not an exemption clause, you know. It's not that it's harming competition, but it can be good for something else, so we will bless it. I think that's not at all the idea. So that's how I see things, at least.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. Before moving to Q&A, one final thing that I wanted to touch upon very short, as I'm aware there's also going to be a discussion this afternoon on remedies, but how can remedies contribute to taking into account efficiencies more? Nick, I know you have strong views on this, of course, coming from your experience. So just a couple of minutes to present your thoughts on this.
So this is sort of coming out of the Vodafone 3 case in the UK. And for me, the Vodafone 3 case was about the efficiencies. You know, the remedies were how the CMA got to its end decision, in my mind. And I think the key thing for me is if you believe that the efficiencies are genuine and that actually the net effect of the merger is positive, but maybe you have a slight uncertainty about whether those efficiencies might actually be delivered, well then why wouldn't you use a remedy to ensure that that does happen? Now, there might be issues of enforceability, but that was dealt with in that case by using Ofcom, the telecoms regulator, essentially as the enforcer under the telecoms licenses. But my point sort of just comes back to if you think the net answer from the merger is positive, why wouldn't you use remedies which might ensure that that is delivered, rather than maybe chucking the baby out with the bathwater? The other point, of course, just on remedies in that particular case, actually, is that one of the most important remedies was actually not a remedy, which was actually the spectrum divestment to one of the other mobile network operators, which actually ensured that you would have 3 operators who were all able to invest and had incentives to invest, because you had 3 strong competitors. But Guillaume, you might want to respond to that.
So I may be taking a step back, and I don't want to go into cases, specific cases, especially from other authorities, where I understand commitments were both on investment remedies and on price caps. So I think it was a case where I guess it was assumed that prices would go up. I think, there are different types of cases, cases where you assume, then there's a trade-off. You assume that this price is going up, and then you have a trade-off assuming that investments overall in the market, not only from the parties, overall would go up. How do you trade that off? I think these are very complex issues. If price competition, because there are different types of discussions on innovation and efficiencies. There are those who say, well, the merger, brings efficiencies. It's not harming price competition, and it brings, innovation. So the real discussions are really about, you have a case where prices will go up in the short term and even longer. It can be also dynamic price effects, it can give versus, innovation, plans. So there's a question of quantities, how much the price will go up, how much innovation is planned to go up. Now, I think we should take a step back and be serious about efficiencies. Either, we think and we have identified a mechanism through which, we think that it's more likely than not that innovation and, will come in the market and will be sustainable. Because it's an economic incentive. It's pro-competitive, essentially. It outweighs any other concern. I think that should be our aim. And if that's the case, we should take responsibility and say, well, this is an efficiency. There's no need for commitments. Because, otherwise it's useless. Then you over-regulate firms. We know from experience that market circumstances may change. You will not revoke the merger. You will not put a fine because it would go against the incentive to invest. And I think that's the experience that, the Commission and other authorities, like the French authority, by the way, in telecoms as well, some years ago, or the German authority had. So I think we'd rather engage very seriously on the efficiencies and make sure that we have the right tools to identify what can, make the difference. And it has happened. It's not new, because I always hear, no, you've never taken into account efficiencies. No, it's not true. There were cases in telecoms, but also in other, other areas. There was a case on recycling. There was a case even in some cases where it was accepted, but it didn't make the difference. But sometimes it makes a difference because it means that you don't have to provide a remedy for a specific issue and only for another one. So it has happened. We need to improve, certainly, especially on dynamic efficiencies. It's a difficult task, but I think the mindset for us is not to over-regulate firms with caps and so on. It's rather to make sure in the first place that we're all comfortable with what is the rationale and what can be demonstrated. I think that's the point, because if you always say, oh yes, it's very uncertain, but we'll promise something, it's not really the mindset of merger enforcers work in terms of making a choice and taking responsibility on what is more likely than not, both on the harm, which is also, the burden of proof is quite high for the Commission. It's not, and I think for the benefits, that should be the mindset, because otherwise you end up with, something on paper, but which is not economically, shown as we would like it to be. So that's essentially, I think, the mindset. But, I think we will engage on these issues, certainly, as we always do on commitments. But I think that's the mindset on looking at efficiencies is really a part of the assessment on the overall effect of the merger.
And just to be clear, there was a capacity effect in the efficiency as well as a quality effect. So the net effect was zero. I hope if we'd spent 18 months with you going through all the evidence, we'd end up in the same place, but we will never know that.
Thank you very much. From today's panel, as well as from the discussion we had back in June, I see some consensus on the importance of analyzing and incorporating efficiencies in merger analysis, but also a shared recognition of the need to carefully manage this trade-off between flexibility and enforceability. So authorities are open to evaluating a wide range of pro-competitive efficiencies, but also want to ensure, as Guillaume just said, that their decisions remain economically robust and firmly grounded in competition principles. So with this, let me open the floor for questions. We have been efficient in taking notes from the audience online. So let me innovate and start from asking a question that has been raised in the chat.
Yes, this is from Will Whiteley from Frontier Economics. He asks, how can there be confidence that synergies, primarily benefiting the merging companies, actually translate into efficiencies to benefit the wider market and consumers? Could they not be, in many instances, quite different?
Shall I start it? As I mentioned synergies, the answer is they could be different. I think it's part of the overall competition assessment as to whether those synergies will actually result in investment and innovation that benefits the consumer, or whether it goes to shareholders. And part of that is it's part of the overall competition assessment. And it, in the UK case, one of the main complainants was BT, the market leader, which said that they said that they would be facing a stronger competitor, but actually that ended up being part of the answer, that there will be competition from the market leader and the other players, which would ensure that those synergies and benefits would actually end up being passed on to consumers.
I think that maybe remedies, we were talking about it, maybe remedies could be a tool of helping us to deal with these two possible outcomes. So maybe a remedy to address the competition problem without eliminating the net positive effects linked to the logic of the integration. So maybe governance commitments that protect innovation, but also protect the incentives, the competitive incentives of how innovation is going to be implemented and to be successful, maybe a way of dealing with that. But it's not an easy question, right?
Well, I don't want to add too much. I think this is a fundamental criteria, the pass on to customers, essentially. So customers and consumers, finally, it depends at what level of the chain you are, but I think that should always be the aim. I think, obviously, those, the decision makers have a big responsibility, because, obviously, if you approve a merger, either way, you have this responsibility every time. Whether it's about efficiencies, harm, or, clearing a merger, you always have that in mind, that, you're approving it with the assumption that either it will be neutral, no negative impact, but then if it's about, balancing positive effects versus potential concerns, you need to have some good, evidence that it's likely that it will happen. Let's be clear, merger control is forward-looking, it's a balance of probabilities, it's not a crystal ball, unfortunately, but I think it's fundamental that everyone understands that there's indeed the duty for competition enforcer to take their responsibility, that it can explain that, there will be benefits, not only for shareholders, maybe, because otherwise they wouldn't make the deal in the first place, but for the market, for the market, either way. And I think that's a very difficult exercise, obviously, but we have to demonstrate that economically, with sound economics.
Is there a question in the room? Here.
Thank you. Cyril Hariton, Analysis Group. Quick question. Some of the efficiencies are likely to be in different markets than when the harm lies. This has been a question for quite some time. So what is your views on that? And practically, what will be your advice to companies that face this reality? Should they come forward, and will you be willing to balance effects in different markets?
So I think it's an important question, but I think there are different constellations, right? There are those benefits that, we said, it has to have a benefit on consumers, and again, there are different constellations. There are, benefits that may be wider than the market, which is affected. So they are included within these benefits because it's part, it's wider than the market as narrowly defined. In that case, the question is indeed to what extent they benefit. Remember that, there's a consistency to have. The treaty on Article 101, imposes that there's a fair benefit to consumers. I think that's the same question in merger control, whether I think it's in the EU or not. I mean, obviously it can have different impact. You can have collective benefits, and they are part of that, and then you can, consider it. What is very challenging is to think that, a merger has a benefit in Japan, and the consumers who are harmed are in France, for example. You will understand that, I think it's not really likely that these benefits can be taken into account. The court itself in MasterCard, where there were two-sided markets, put the point that if they are out of market efficiencies, you can only take them into account to the extent that the customers are the same, and it may happen. So that, you need to have these customers who are harmed benefiting, because otherwise you have trade-offs that are very, potentially very politically sensitive. Imagine that you have a harm in Belgium and a benefit in the Netherlands. Will you say that one consumer group is not as important as the other? That's not really realistic. But on top of that, I think the guidance from the court in antitrust has been also quite, telling. So I think we need to keep in mind these different constellations of cases. That's all I can say at this stage.
Thank you.
But perhaps if I can just give a UK perspective. In the UK, there is a concept called relevant customer benefits, which is meant to capture those out-of-market benefits that might be, for example, in downstream markets. So if you're a telecoms company and that enables growth or benefits in other markets that use your services, then those can be captured under the relevant customer benefits analysis.
Thank you, Nick. Well, I may be biased, but I think this has been a very exciting discussion. So please join me in thanking our panelists for this excellent debate.